Everyone. Welcome to this week. And we will be talking about homicide and property crime victimization. So, up until this point, we've kind of gone over some theoretical underpinnings of victimology, kind of talked about the victim rights movement and some of the services and things that are available to victims. But this part of the semester is when we kind of dive into certain types of crimes and study the victims of those crimes. So as always, I will say, make sure you take notes. I'll timestamp this so that you can go back and watch sections you may need further clarification on or anything like that. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to start out with homicide. And homicide is typically one of those topics that everyone is very interested in talking about and kind of it's the glorified crime, I call it, because it's the one that we typically see on TV and in the and in the media. But before we kind of dive into homicide, we need to get some definitions straight. So homicide and murder are two different things. Homicide is the intentional and sometimes unintentional or accidental killing of another person. Homicide is like your big umbrella. Murder falls under homicide. So, murder is the unlawful taking of a human life. Murder is the behavioral action that terminates life in the context of power, personal gain, brutality, and sometimes sexuality. So homicide can be intentional or unintentional, but murder is very intentional. See how prevalent is homicide in our nation. So homicide is typically classified through the UCR, and we get our data through the UCR, and there's a supplementary homicide report that comes through that. And we've talked about the UCR. So it's the earliest classification system in the United States. And its purpose was to classify homicides. Contrary to popular belief, homicides have steadily decreased in the 90s. So in the 80s, you saw this big panic. 70s was really your serial killer kind of um, era where there was a lot of mass hysteria around homicides and serial killers, and we did see a lot of serial killers during that time. The 80s kind of bled over from the serial killer. There was a mass hysteria around crime in general. Um, Juveniles were deemed as super predators during this time and kind of targeted um, that they were these incredibly dangerous individuals, and so there was a continued scare around homicide. But when we look at the data, the 90s is really when the homicide rates declined. It is interesting to note that in the 2000s, we started to see an increase in homicides. So you can see about 13,594 persons were murdered in 2014. And then in 2015, that went up about 2,000. And it represented an 11% increase in homicides. However, recent data dating back to 2018, um, we note that those homicides have decreased again. So overall, our homicide rates in the United States are decreasing, and they're not as prevalent as one would think. What do victims of homicide look like? We've talked kind of about the myths and fallacies of victimization. You should know by now that young black males are typically victims, especially if they live in like urban areas. But let's kind of look and see what the statistics show us. So, going off of 2018 data, 77.3% of homicide victims were males. 45.6% were between 17 and 29 years old, and 43.8% were white. There is an immense overrepresentation of Black individuals in the homicide rates. Black individuals account for about 53.3% of the homicides that are committed, while they only comprise about 13.5% of the U.S. population. So let that sink in. They only account for approximately, let's say, approximately 40 or 14% of the U.S. population. Looking at that cluster, they account for 53, over half of the overall homicide victimizations that we account for. That's insane. In fact, homicide is the leading cause of death for Black males aged 1 to 44. And this is an important aspect to kind of learn about the victimology of homicides. Most homicides are intra-racial, about 83%. Now, intra-racial means same race on race. So Black on Black, white on white, Hispanic on Hispanic. So the majority of our homicides are Black on Black homicides. Let that sink in. We believe, and there's this fallacy that homicide victims are kind of like the strangers in the dark. And that's just not the case. Most of the time, as you will see, I'm going to break down some of these statistics for you, but as you will see, normally you know the offender, and normally it's pretty much same race. Here's the gender breakdown. So you see, males account for 78%, females 23%. And it's always fascinating to look at this because we see the fallacy of the lowly female who thinks she's going to get murdered walking down the street, and that's just not backed up by statistics. Yes, that does happen, but the majority of females who are murdered in intimate partner violence. And here's the race breakdown. So you see, the majority of victims are Black or African American, and are males. Now, this is also fascinating because this is an age breakdown. So we know that the majority of homicide victims are African American, ages 1 to 49. So that's this section right in here. Let me get my pointer. That's this section right in here. But when we look at this data more, you see that age 20 to 29 and is your highest chances of being victimized if you're an African American male. There are leading theories around this. I have my own theories around this. I think a lot of gang violence plays into an aspect of these victimizations. And when are you mostly involved in gangs or detrimental social situations is typically in your teens, early 20s. And so that plays a major factor here. So here's your relationship. And this is another interesting thing. So you will see that the majority of homicide are murder, specifically murders. So remember, murder is the intentional act of taking someone's life. That is not accidental. And so you will see that the majority of murders are from friends or acquaintances. That's about 43%. Now, your next highest is strangers at 19%. So that there is some semblance of stranger on stranger homicides and murders, but the majority of offenders are someone that they know. So, what are some takeaways that we can kind of look at this data and come away with? Overall, homicide rates have declined in recent years. That's the number one takeaway. Then we look at our lifetime murder victimization rates, which is essentially your chances of dying in a homicide. Overall, it is 1 in 4,000. You have a 1 in 4,000 chance, a little over 4,000 chance of dying by a homicide. If you are white and you are male, you have about a 1 in 3,000, little, probably about 1 in 3,700 chance of dying. But if you are black, you have a 1 in 856 chance of dying via murder, which is staggering. I'll just let that one kind of sink in. Here's kind of a scale. So your odds at being a victim of homicide is the highest when you are a black male. Here. Then if you are a black female, that's the second highest odds. White male, and then your lowest odds of being a homicide victim is if you are a white female. So it's a scale. It runs your highest chances is up at the top, and it runs down. The lower you are on this rung, the lower the chances of dying via homicide. The highest odds of being a homicide victim is in your at younger ages. Your odds fall greatly after late teens, early 20s. So realistically, um, 20 to 29 is your highest chance of being a homicide victim, and it's those early 20s that encompass in that. So like 20 to 25, and then it starts declining. So when we think of homicides, we think of kind of weapon usage. And there's some really cool data to kind of look at around weapon usage and homicides. So here's a breakdown of weapon usage from the UCR. And you will see that the overall majority of homicide murders that had weapons used handguns, which is about 47%, or some other firearm, so about 14%. So overall, firearm usage took up about over 50%, half of all the weapons usage, which is, I don't think anything that's staggering to know. Like, I think that's something that we all figured was going on. We know that there's an epidemic of gun violence going on right now, um, but kind of looking at it like this. Firearms are the second leading cause of injury related deaths in the United States. They're used in approximately 73% of all homicides. So, that chart that I just showed you had like the different classifications of firearms. Adding all of those together, they account for about 73% of all homicides. Knives and sharp objects were the second um, leading weapons used, and they account for about 11%. Homicides are 3 times as likely to be aggravated assaults using firearms. So, the majority of times, if there is a homicide with a weapon, it is with a firearm. Now that we've kind of talked about the scope of the problem, seen some data involved, let's turn to some victimological aspects of homicide. So, essentially, if you have a murder, that means someone is deceased, and there are some special circumstances that come with um, working some of those type of cases that we have to kind of account for. The first is death notification. So, death notification is essentially telling the next of kin that someone has died. And this task typically falls to law enforcement. Um, Sometimes victim advocates do it, but it's majority law enforcement that makes those death notifications. And death notifiers deal with a wide range of responses. It's you'll learn that death notification is a part of the process of the investigation, but you never know what you're going to get. Um, and essentially, the initial notification impacts the grieving process. So, how the person delivers the news can help the grieving process or be detrimental to the grieving process. Death notification process has four components to it. So, first is information gathering. And this is the most important element um, to the death notification. And essentially, you're obtaining and verifying the identity of the decedent. You're going to gather information around the circumstances surrounding death, including time and place and acquaintances. So you're going to ask, do they know where that person was, who that person was supposed to be with, things like that. The second component to the process of death notification is control and direction. So here, this is all about delivery. And essentially, you want to deliver factual, honest, and deliberate information. You don't want to give um, false promises, and you want to avoid euphemism. So you want to avoid saying like, "Oh, they're in a better place now," or something like that. The purpose of the death notifier is to be um, truthful and factual. Now, there will be facts that you cannot give, but then again, you give the facts that you're at liberty to discuss. The third step in this process is assessment. Normally, it will be an investigator who gives the death notification, unless it's like a car wreck or something like that, and um, there's not an investigator. But we're talking in terms of homicide, so there would be an investigator. The assessment component of this is you are assessing the reaction of the person that you're giving the notification. Now, I know this sounds very cold and calculating, but remember, um, the majority of homicides are done by friends or acquaintances or someone that this person knows. So the investigator is starting to piece together stories and timelines. And so, how this person reacts to you giving this news says a lot about whether they should be on the list of potential suspects or not. If it is a husband that killed his wife, he may not show as much emotion as a mother who unexpectedly lost her child. Now, I will caution you here on this stance as well. Not everyone grieves the same. And we're going to talk about the grieving process here in a minute. But um, the assessment process is only a part of this process and should not be taken in and of itself as a measure of guilt. And then the final step in the death notification process is the referral process. So the majority of these people never expected to wake up and have a loved one die. And what do we know about homicide victims? They're young. So most likely they were never expected to be near death. So they may not have had a will. They may have not had burial plots. They may not have, um, they may be leaving behind a family. So part of that death notification process is to kind of help the family know what the next steps are. You have to inform the family how to make funeral arrangements, the process of getting the body from the medical examiner's office, or if there's still um, evidence. What is the police protocol to release the body once they say? Um, and so the death notifier really is responsible for kind of helping them um, know what to do. Normally, they will turn them over to a victim advocate after the initial notification, and that victim advocate, as you learned, will kind of help walk them through the process of next steps around court hearings, and kind of link them up to services for counseling and things like that. And I wanted to touch on the grief process here, because no matter what we do in the criminal justice system, if you go into law enforcement, you're probably going to have to deliver a death notification, or you're going to be a part of a death in some sense. Um, you need to have an understanding of the grief process in and of itself. This is a process that has been empirically backed up, to kind of help us determine how people deal with grief and shocking news. So, the first part is denial. And denial is essentially the short term, immediate response of, no, you've got the wrong house, or no, that this isn't possible. Um, Denial is very self-protective. They don't want to come to terms with the news that they just got. They want to protect themselves, and so they go into denial and be like, "This is not possible. This is a dream. I'm going to wake up." That type of thing. Denial then turns into anger, and anger is toward anyone or anything that is available. They will lash out at you. They will lash out at anyone that is in their line of sight. This is a normal process. Anger is a normal process of the part of the grief process. Anger then turns into bargaining and depression, and bargaining and depression typically go hand in hand. So, this is where you typically see them breaking down and start sobbing, pleading, trying to make deals with a higher being, make deals with whatever, and then they will go into self isolation. And then at the end of this process is acceptance, and that's when usually acceptance happens after like the funeral and all of that, um, where they realize that they have to go on with their life. And part of acceptance is accepting the new reality that they face. And so therapeutic services help them kind of deal with this process. But as first responders, we see this process working immediately. And you can shoot through the first two, maybe three, within minutes of having notifications. Although I was never a law enforcement officer, as a child abuse investigator, I was there whenever like doctors had to deliver death notifications, and I was there whenever I had to work child deaths, and so you typically see in my interactions with families who had a child death, even though the parents were pretty much the prime suspects, you still see some of this grief process happening. We've looked at some statistics around victimization of homicide, kind of some of the process after homicide has happened that police need to do. Now we're going to take a deep dive into homicide itself. We are going to learn about different types of homicides, different types of murders, serial murder, things like that. The reason I'm going to spend so much time on this is because um, law enforcement uses victimology to help them solve crimes and to help them solve murders. So victimology shows us that the majority of homicide victims are young black males, but the majority of victims are also killed by someone they know, and firearms are typically used. The deeper you get into like looking at the types of murders and like when we talk about serial killers, I'm going to talk to you kind of about profiling some. I'm going to give you a taste of profiling and how we use victimology to kind of profile that. All right. So the first type of homicide is a single homicide. And this is a single victim in one homicidal event. So with these, you're going to want to pay attention to the number of victims and the number of events. That typically tells us what type of homicide it is, and then it's going to kind of tell us how to classify um, some of the murders. So single homicide is one victim, one event. A double homicide is two victims are killed at one time in one location. This is the Alex Murdaugh mugshot and his victims. I don't know if you pay attention to the news, but Alex Murdaugh was a South Carolina attorney who wound up murdering his wife and one of his sons, um, probably about 2 years ago, 3 years ago. I think it was really big last year when he was on trial. Like they made a Netflix documentary and all of that. But essentially, he was swindling money and he killed his wife and his son to kind of take the spotlight away from that money swindling. A triple homicide is just like it sounds. There's three victims that are killed in one time in one location. So single, double, and triple, they differ in the amount of victims, but they all happen at one time in one location. That is very important. Then we get to something called mass murder. And mass murder is the killing of four or more victims in a single event with a single location within a few moments or hours. There are two subtypes of mass murder. Your classic mass murder is one person operating in one location at one time. The person that I have on here is James Holmes. This was the Dark Knight mass murder in Colorado. It's the 2012 Aurora, Colorado movie theater shooting. He essentially came in one person. He killed 12 people and injured 70 at the Century 16 movie theater in July at the premiere of The Dark Knight. Um, Subsequently, he has been sentenced to 12 consecutive life sentences plus 3,318 years without parole. Um, but he is a classic mass murderer. He walked into the movie theater and just started shooting. He killed four more victims. Um, and did not have any type of cooling off period, did not leave and go somewhere else to kill other people. All of his victims were at the theater. The other subcategory of mass murder is a family mass murder. And essentially, this is where four or more family members are killed together at a single moment. That brings us to spree and serial murder. Now, this is not a serial murder class. This is not a profiling class. But it is important for us to understand some of the dynamics of these type of murders in order to understand how victimology plays a role. So far, we've gotten up to four victims, right? Um, Now we are going to kind of turn our attention. The single, double, triple homicide, and then the um, mass murder all took place with one location in one incident. What happens when murder happens all over multiple event or multiple locations? Um, during a prolonged period of time. Well, that's where we start talking about spree and serial murder. Spree is a single event with two or more locations and no cooling off period. Now, we're going to talk about this cooling off period because that's a very important aspect to help us differentiate between spree and serial murder. But a spree murder is I go to McDonald's and I shoot up the McDonald's. Then I go to the Aurora movie theater and I kill 12 more people there. It was a very short time span, but the murders happened in two or more locations. A serial murder is defined by the FBI as the unlawful killing of two or more victims by the same offender in separate events over a prolonged period of time. Now, there's been some debate around this definition of how many victims um, accounts for a true serial murder. The official FBI definition is two or more. Your book definition says three or more because there have been several debates around it. Recently, after 2005, it got changed to two or more. So, um, but essentially, you have a certain component for serial murder. It's the same offender that kills in separate locations over a prolonged period of time. They have this cooling off period. Cooling off period leads me into some of the major differences between spree and serial murder. So, cooling off period essentially means that the offender took a break. This break can last a few days, a few weeks, a few months, but it is the key characteristic that distinguishes a spree murderer from a serial murderer. Serial murderers, think of John Wayne Gacy. He didn't kill all of his victims on the same day in the same incident, prolonged over years. Um, that's the key between the two. Victim selection also tells us a lot about the differentiation between the two. Classical mass murderers and spree murderers do not care who their victims are. They randomly go in and just start killing. Serial murderers purposefully pick their victims, and it's typically to fulfill some type of fantasy. Victim selection tells us a lot about who killed who and the type of classification. Serial murderers also monitor their victim's behavior. They would have probably stalked this victim for a prolonged period of time, and they monitor the ongoing investigation. Typically, not always, typically with a mass murderer or a spree murderer, they will die during the commission of the crime. They will be killed by the police. It's part of their purpose. Not all the time, but the majority of time. A serial murderer will go undetected for potentially years, but they will monitor, depending on their typology, will monitor the investigation outcome to avoid detections. All right. So now we're going to dive into um, serial murder offender typologies. Um, we don't have a profiling class in our department. And I know a lot of people are interested in profiling and things like that. So I wanted to spend some time on this because this is really kind of fun stuff. But when a serial murder happens, victimology tells us a lot, and the crime scene tells us a lot. And so now I'm going to kind of tell you how we use victimology to kind of help solve the crime. The first typology is known as the organized offender. And the organized offender is one who is highly intelligent, who plans the murder, who often uses a lure to or a ruse to get the victim to come with them. Victims are typically strangers and fulfill some type of fantasy role for the offender. These offenders are highly intelligent and will adapt their behavior during the crime. So if they have planned to take the victim somewhere and they go there and someone is there that they weren't expecting, they will go to another location. Control is essential for the organized offender. Both of these typologies have some type of sexual component to them. Serial murder has some type of sexual component to them. The organized offender is all about controlling the victim while they are alive. That is a key. The sexual fantasy is with a live victim, and they will typically bring their own weapon. They typically will take some type of personal belongings after the commission of the crime to remember the victim. So, like a ring, or they'll take their own photos, something like that. But the organized offender also hides the body and conceals the crime. That is also key. In childhood, the what we know through the FBI behavioral analysis unit and things like that is in childhood, organized offenders generally had fathers who had steady employment but were inconsistently disciplined. So these offenders had some type of entitlement issues. They feel superior to everyone else, so that therefore that control aspect is essential to their crime. These offenders typically are your neighbors, um, and they go undetected. Um, they typically have jobs, families, and successful social networks. Think of Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was a um, highly organized offender. Now, on the other spectrum is the unorganized offender. And the unorganized offender, best way I know to kind of tell you this, is the one who has extreme mental illness. They have a mental illness that snaps, and they kill. So they typically kill quickly in a blitz style. Any weapons that they use are weapons of opportunity, so weapons that are present. So they break into a home and they use a baseball bat that they found by the door. They overkill tremendously. So, you typically see overkill like with stab wounds in the chest, throat, and face. They don't take symbolic trophies, but they typically take some type of what we would deem as weird items. So these type of offenders will take like body parts with them. They typically don't have their own mode of transportation. Um, and if they perform any sexual acts, it's going to be with the corpse, not necessarily with the person being alive, like the organized offender. What we know about these type of offenders is their family dynamic. They grow up in families where father's work is unstable, the family life is unstable, probably violent, and probably is pervasive with mental illness. The perpetrator typically internalizes hurt, anger, and fear, is unable to let off steam, and lacks verbal or physical skills to express emotion. Um, they are typically seen as unattractive and not socially well connected. And if they live with anyone, it's normally going to be a single parent. They are chronic underachievers, both academically and professionally. So they might be intelligent, but they might be working as a janitor. They have no motivation to do anything further. The biggest with victim is typically your victims here are typically going to be strangers for both organized and unorganized offenders. But the way that the body is seen is going to tell us a lot. If there's a lot of overkill, so if there's like 80 to 90 stab wounds, you're probably looking at an unorganized offender because overkill is present. Whereas if you have the throat that's cut and maybe um, um, like some cuts in the thighs, that might tell us that that's an organized offender because they wanted to drain the blood, something like that. All right. So all of this has been murder and homicide. Now we are going to turn to property crimes. Property crimes are the most common type of crimes in the United States, and the intent of these offenses is the theft of money or property, but there is usually uh, no threat or force used against the victim. We will talk about those times that there is some type of force or threat for property crimes, but overall, you typically don't see threat or force during these type of crimes. Property crimes are the number one types of crimes in the United States, but much like murder, property crimes have been decreasing um, in recent reports. There was an overall decrease in property crimes of about 1.3% in 2015, and we still see that. So when we talk about property crimes, there's several types. So the first is robbery, and robbery is going to go really kind of against the norm uh, of the intent. So robbery is taking or attempting to take anything of value from the care, custody, or control of a person by force, um, and or putting the victim in fear. Whereas larceny or theft is taking a personal property without permission but does not involve force. So you have this notion of force. And when force is utilized, you're typically looking at robbery. When force is not utilized, like shoplifting or breaking and entering while the victim's not there, you're looking at theft or larceny. So let's look at some of the statistics. Robberies are declining. They've decreased from 2014 in our 2017 stats, they decreased about 12%. 2018, in looking at a 9-year pattern, they were down 31%. There's an estimated robbery rate of 86.2 per 100,000 inhabitants. So we see that decreasing year over year as well. So overall, our stats on robbery show that that type of crime is decreasing. And we use the UCR to kind of help us with uh, property crimes and kind of the stats around property crimes. Larceny and theft is very common. It's probably one of the most common types of property crimes, but you will see it is decreasing as well. Larceny theft account for about 72% of all property crimes, and the most common types of theft is motor vehicle theft and shoplifting. I used to work in loss prevention for a retail store, and so my entire job there was to catch shoplifters. Probably the most fun job I've ever had. All right, here's a breakdown that I found that I just thought was a cool representation of all the types of larceny theft. Um, this also falls into white collar crime. Larceny does. So this 31% right here is probably your white collar crime. But then you're going to see motor vehicles and shoplifting account for about over 45%. You're really about 48% of all larceny. So now let's look at burglary. Because we've talked about robbery, theft, and burglary is your other type of property crime. Burglary is the uninvited and illegal entry into a person's property, cargo container, any vehicle or vessel. Burglary occurs every 13 seconds in the United States, and the front door is typically the most common entry point. Frequently, burglary is a secondary crime or a byproduct of committing another crime, which is typically more serious. So, typically, you will see burglary and robbery, or burglary and sexual assault, something like that. So, that occurs every 13 seconds statistic is kind of scary. We see that the annual burglary rates in the United States have decreased dramatically since about 2011. 2011 is right here. Let me get my pointer. 2011 is right here. And so you see that it's drastically kind of decreased all the way up to 2021. Four types of burglary, or four categories that fall into burglary that we're going to take some time to talk about. So the first type is a completed burglary. And a completed burglary is a person who has no legal right to be present in the structure successfully gains entry into the residence by use of force or without force. So burglary can be force or no force, but the completed burglary is just that. They've successfully gained entry. Forcible entry is the completed burglary in which force is used to gain entry. So once we begin using force, that is forcible entry. The third is unlawful entry without force. So completed burglary committed by someone having no legal right to the premises without using force. So you're going to ask, well, what does force mean? Well, let's say that you are bringing in groceries and they stick a gun to the back of your back and say, let me in. That is forcible entry. Or you just got done unloading groceries and you are getting ready to shut the door and a group of teenagers burst in. That is forcible entry. Unlawful entry would be like the windows open so they get into the window. Does that make? I hope that makes sense. And then again, attempted forcible entry is just the attempt. It can be with or without force, but they don't actually complete it. And so that brings us to our final type of property crime, and it's that of home invasion. And home invasion is a situation in which one or more perpetrators force entry into a home where inhabitants are present for the purposes of robbery, rape, or other criminal activity. These usually involve highly violent activities. A home invasion is typically a violent crime. It distinguishes between robbery, as home invasion have the purposes of not avoiding contact with the homeowner. Confrontation is key in home invasions. They are meant to come face to face with the homeowner in an attempt to probably do something to the homeowner. All right, that concludes our presentation for this week. I hope you all have a great week, and if you need anything, feel free to holler.